Hi, everybody. I'm Stephen Burks, and today is my first day hosting Design and Dialogue. So excited to be here with my very first guest, Ini Archibong. You guys, Ini probably doesn't need much of an introduction, but born in America, based in Switzerland, Ini has developed a diverse portfolio of furniture and luxury products and addition to objects. And his practice draws from popular culture, as well as spiritual traditions and arts of performance. Our conversation today will focus on his practice and his creative process. I'd also like to add that this is Ini's second conversation on Design and Dialogue. The first time he spoke on June 5th with Glenn Adamson was a very different kind of conversation, very personal, on the subject of race inequality in America. So that's available if you guys would like to see that as well. This talk, however, will focus on Ini's creative work and his creative process. And lastly, before we begin, I want to say that this conversation has particular significance to me, as I believe it represents a generational shift. I've been working in this industry nearly 20 years, and, and Ini is the first other African-American voice that has come along at the highest level. So I'm grateful to you, brother, for being here and doing your work. And you know, I'm truly proud to be in dialogue with you. And I want to say that that this was your idea, in fact, that we get together and chat like this. So
yeah.
I
think it goes without saying that how grateful I am to you for blazing the trail. I mean, it's one of those things where there weren't a lot of examples to look up to that looked like me, and I knew who all of them were. And when I was in school, it was you and Garth Roberts.
Yeah.
And I think he's Canadian.
Yeah. That's an important distinction.
Yeah, I mean, to be completely honest, it's like, I feel like, and this might be for later in the conversation, but the diaspora is its own country.
Yeah. That's right.
So,
that's right.
You can be Canadian, you can be German, you can be, whatever nationality you have. I'll always feel a certain kind of kinship with the rest of the children of the diaspora out there.
Yeah, there's a commonality that binds us all, for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
For sure. So, how to begin?
Yeah.
We'd love
to
know
see the images. I think are the images going?
Not yet, but
okay.
I'm gonna cue that up. And I guess for everyone tuning in, as you listen and as you have questions or comments for Ini and I, please put them in the chat. Ini, I guess you could maybe start from where you're calling in from, where you're joining us from.
Yeah. I actually just landed like 2 hours ago in Berlin. It's the first flight since February that I've made, which is pretty crazy for me because last year I was on a flight basically every 7 to 10 days. But it was an interesting experience. And now, I'm in my hotel room waiting to get to some Berlin work, which is always exciting. Recently all the trips to Berlin have been for synthesizer education and explorations for the Speechless show last year, and got some more stuff kind of cooking, we'll say. So interesting. Here to learn some new tricks.
Right on. I want to hear a lot about your relationship to music, but I guess first, I'd love to kind of have a bit of backstory and understand how you found your way to design. And this is probably going to be a question that I ask every guest.
Yeah.
So, but I
The
think
question that I get asked by most journalists.
yeah, but it's particularly interesting, I think, for us because
Yeah,
in my case anyway, design wasn't necessarily an option that I knew about. So just
exactly.
curious how it happened for you.
Yeah, I mean, same thing for me. I didn't know that design was an option until I was around in my 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And this was even after having grown up literally like, with biking distance from art center. And I would go up there and look at the car models, but it never crossed my mind that it was that place produced anything except for cars.
Right,
Right.
right.
But yeah, it was funny that it was such a roundabout path to becoming a designer because, in retrospect, I started training as a designer very young. And, obviously like my daughter who plays with blocks, there's a bit of like architecture and design and stuff in the way we play. And I love my micro machines and my, star bases and everything else and my GI Joes like everyone else did. But I'm actually more so thinking about when I was pre-adolescent, like when I was 12 years old was when I started using 3D software back in the days of CompUSA. And for me, like a Saturday afternoon or Sunday afternoon after church, going to Fedco and then stopping by CompUSA was like going to Disneyland for me. I'd be reaching for softwares and begging my parents for them. And, invariably, inevitably, Christmas would come along and I got Corel Draw and softwares like that. So needless to say, I was an outlier amongst my friends because when I came home from playing outside, I would jump on the computer and start 3D modeling TIE fighters and try to figure out how to animate them shooting each other.
I mean, I guess most people don't realize that designers at a young age are nerds, completely.
Yeah. like super nerd. I mean, it's actually really, it's funny now. It wasn't that funny as when I was a youth because most of my friends like in my neighborhood and like surrounding neighborhoods that I hung out with were like the cool guys in Pasadena, and cool and known and all these things. And we grew up together, so we were always friends. But I had like big, thick glasses, rode a skateboard, and listened to Rage Against the Machine.
Yeah.
And, amongst my African-American peers, that wasn't necessarily the coolest stuff to be doing.
Right. No, but I think that speaks a lot to how this kind of artistic profession is considered alternative, right? I mean,
yeah, completely.
When you talk about Rage Against the Machine, I think about the idea of alternative being a subculture, And so as a gateway into design, it totally makes sense that you're already operating sort of on the fringe.
On the fringe and in geek space. I mean, my parents are also like Ivy League educated engineers, computer scientists.
Okay.
So my household was one where it's not like it was just about education. It was about intelligence, learning, self-sufficiency, motivation, all those things was part of our upbringing, So, I would get made fun of because, when the street lights came on, that old adage, I had to be in the house. And when summertime hit and all the kids could wake up and go outside and just start playing, I wasn't allowed to go out and play until we would have to read a certain amount before we could do anything. Geeky kid. And yeah, it led me to things like the 3D softwares and tinkering with computers and unscrewing anything that had screws in it.
And you also had a kind of private school education, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it was, I mean.
So that set you apart from the guys in the neighborhood, I suppose.
Definitely, definitely. I mean, the neighborhood that I like, my actual street was actually a cul-de-sac, and you know, we were a little bit spared from some of the things that were happening like in all the streets surrounding. Simply because when you have a cul-de-sac, I think the adults, well, now in retrospect, I can see that the adults really came together to make sure that our block was, you know, uh, a safe place. And you know, even though we still got into shenanigans,
Yeah, yeah,
it
yeah.
was it was it was not that. It's not like I was ostracized because I didn't go to school with everybody else. You know, it was just kind of what it was. I think mostly the feeling of being different in that sense came when interacting with other people that didn't know me,
Mhm.
that maybe thought that it was strange, you know, the words that I that I used, and the fact that, you know, in my house we would be, you know, we would get in trouble for using slang and things like that. So, um, you know, I just wasn't the hippest outside of my close knit circle.
Sure.
But
Just jumping
but
in
it,
here for everyone that's joined us, we're looking at a kind of stream of consciousness of Ini's life here. So there'll be personal images, family photos, just pictures of kind of his adventures from his youth forward around the world. And I think that's significant because for me, what's kind of unique about your practice, Ini, is that you've made a decision, first of all, to leave the States, to study abroad,
yeah,
and leave the States to be based in Europe, to kind of be closer to the clients, both in luxury and in furniture that you're working with. But you also have a foothold here with your family still in California, your work with the gallery here in New York, et cetera. So you know, I love this idea of you having this kind of extended network, this community that supports you.
yeah,
So from your friends to your brothers, you know, people like Ghetto Gastro, et cetera, that are close to
yeah.
you. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your relationship to your family, and I mean, growing up with two brothers, and
Mhm.
now, if I understand correctly, they're working with you. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean the with in a like in a Nigerian household and community, family is, you know, is everything. So, you know, really my best friends, once I hit adolescence, you know, it was like I had my older brother, and we had two cousins that we would spend summers with, Ubong and Netie, out in South Central LA. And that was like our kind of best friend crew. That was our crew, right?
Right.
So,
Sure.
you know, we did everything together, from, you know, going out and trying to meet girls, hanging out at the Crenshaw Plaza, playing basketball on campus at USC, just like normal teenage stuff. But it was with, you know, family. So like we would have our inside jokes about, you know, kind of mimicking our parents' accents and cracking on each other and all that stuff that most people wouldn't get unless they were within the Nigerian community. And then at the same time, whenever we would go to like weddings and things like that, you know, you're hanging with your best friends. So it built a bond, and also just kind of a mentality that anything that needed to get done could be solved with the people right next to me. I wouldn't, you know, you don't have to go very far to find somebody smart enough in an area that you might be deficient at. You don't need to go very far to find somebody to maybe defend you or have your back if things are going wrong. And who else would you want besides your brothers, cousins, and everything like that? So when, you know, transitioning into adulthood, you know, obviously within brotherhood, there's, you know, there's friction at times, and there's like separation and coming back. But I think now that we're all adults, we've realized that, you know, we each have a sort of baseline commonality, and then we augment each other in all the right ways, you know. So like my older brother is like one of the most impressive people I know, and very pragmatic and practical. But at the same time, when I would witness him tap into the type of state that I try to stay in all the time, I've seen him do like amazing things when he was a pro basketball player, when the creativity was unleashed.
Yeah.
And
So
I
each
think,
of your brothers has a different kind of creativity, right? So your
yeah,
older brother was an athlete, and now I think he's working in business. Your
yeah.
younger brother is a kind of technologist
My younger brother,
and
we
builds
say about
musical instruments.
Archie's the one. This is what we
Artist.
say about Archie. We've been telling him that since he was a kid. He probably has a huge head about it now, but like, yeah, my older brother is, if you asked him, he probably say he's creative. I think for most of his life, he didn't consider himself creative. And especially since, within our family, I was the kind of weird one that was like overly creative, or in the most obvious ways. But, he and I have had these conversations about the fact that creativity has nothing to do with what the actual medium is. It just has to do with your ability to take in information and come up with a novel output from that information, right?
Sure.
So, like, I think for when we think about creativity in that sense, we're mostly talking about tapping into your creativity while in a flow state. And in that sense, sports was integral, I think, for all three of us in unleashing our creativity. All three of us were like athletes. All three of us were college recruits. My older brother, when I was thinking about playing in college, said to me, because he knew me, he was like, "Are you sure you want to do that? It's basically like a job on top of school." I was like, there are a lot of parties here. I don't know if I need another job.
So Ini, you mentioned flow state just now, and I think that
Yeah.
that's very interesting. I'm wondering if you ever come across a book called Flow by a professor at the University of Chicago. I think his name is Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
I think I've seen it. I haven't read it actually, but
so
I've seen it.
it's about this kind of state of optimal performance that we can each tap into, accessing our own kind of creative space. And I'm wondering how that relates to your sense of spirituality and what aspect of that developed out of your family, your close family bonds. You mentioned unity being a core concept. So tell us a little bit about your spiritual background.
I mean, from just a straight objective standpoint, I was raised in the Methodist Church. We were, twice to three times a week churchgoers. Sunday for service and youth group and counselor at Vacation Bible School, church camp every summer. So it was a pretty, I guess you could say, traditional. From the outside looking in, I guess it would seem very traditional Christian upbringing. But I think one of the things that at least I paid attention to, and I just speak for myself because we've actually never had this conversation, my brothers and I. But we had both of our grandmothers living with us. We had an uncle, an amazing uncle who was like in and out, that lived with us for a while and then left. In the back of my mind, I would always look at some of the stuff we had around the house, like the little statues, the raffia, illustrations, and even like stuff like, the floor mat that my dad used to take naps on, just like looking at the stitching and the patterns and trying to understand like the meanings behind all the things I was looking at. So I was really into like our ancestral spirituality as well as, the Christianity that I was learning. And I think pretty early on, I started to see them as related, even though I didn't know that much like information wise about, you know, our ancestral spirituality.
Yeah.
I guess I picked up a lot from little things. Like I remember like when I would do literal translations of our language, BBO, you know, some of the words, you know, led you into spirituality just because the way of describing the way of naming something or saying something would be a sort of spiritual description of what that thing is in essence, right? Or what it does.
Right. It's
Right?
very essential in terms of its description of.
Yeah, it's not really like English. So like when you translate it into English, it becomes kind of funny to put these like very prescriptive words on it. Even like my name it's like you can't really translate it like straight into English. So
How would your name translate? Give us a sense of that.
I'm not the one.
You
You
gotta
should
give
ask
us
my
an
mom.
example.
That's my mom. I mean, so it's I Ini is easy, right? Ini is the word for time.
Okay.
Yeah. Mfun, the second half of my name, Mfon. You know, like when I have cousins named Mfun, and you know, like with like female cousins, and you know, I remember thinking when I was young that, oh, her name in English is Grace, right? And so like Mfun, I think if you try to translate it, is something about grace and the touch of God. If that makes sense, or grace being the touch of God. It's almost like God blessed or something like that, I guess.
Yeah, that makes me wonder, I mean, how you must have been influenced by these kind of spiritual concepts, and I guess, you know, we're all curious how you've applied those concepts to your work.
I mean, to be honest, I might be the wrong person to ask about this. So, okay, well, I can answer that, but because I can answer that, the answer to that is why I can't like describe it or identify it. So the answer to that is I have grown up in a way where there is no separation between your experience of life and spirituality. There's no division. There's no like, this is my spiritual life and then this is what I do for my job, or this is me waking up and walking around, and then this is the time where I, you know, am praying and, you know, doing church things. It's just like and honestly, for me, the concept, the way people talk about even something as simple as prayer, I don't identify with it the same way, because in my way of living, I guess I'm always praying. I'm always praying, and to me, it's also a great way to stay sane and not talk to yourself. Because I think a lot of times when you don't pay attention, the voice in your head isn't you. But if you're spending that energy, you know, being in dialogue with the higher power, then, you know, it kind of, at least for me, feels like I'm constantly moving in the right direction.
So it's a kind of meditative state that you take with you.
Yeah, and like, and it's not, I guess it's just hard to put into words, I guess, but because of that, I don't really know. It's not like I sit down and I say, I'm going to apply some spirituality to this object. It's like, it's just what I do and how I do it. And part of that is also related to that flow state, because I think that's what allows us to stay in the flow state. There's a certain energy that I believe you tap into that puts you in commune with the unseen world in a way that it can be a guiding force with where you lay your feet, right? And the steps you take. A good example of that, I guess, is for me is sports. I mean, that was like one of the first places where I felt it, because we started at such a young age. And, you know, when you get to the point where you don't think when you're playing, you know, when you don't think when you're moving, you just get into a state. People call it the zone. You can call it whatever you want, but for me, it's a spiritual thing, and it's a place where I like to try to remain as much as possible. And it takes a lot of practice. And, you know, throughout my life, I've had different, you could call them physical mnemonic devices to help me, you know, get back into that state. The best one is Rubik's Cube, actually. That really helps a lot.
So, I mean, if we connect that back to your work and the things that you're making, there is a sense of many of your projects inviting participation, or how can I say, related to a particular activity. I'm thinking about one of your early pieces, the stargazing chair, for example. And that, to me, set a kind of beginning in place for this arc that I feel like this journey that you're on, where the things that you're making are kind of trying to express or getting closer to the kind of physicalization of this sense of spirituality that you carry. I suppose the Oracle is another, right? Sort of further along.
I think those are bookends to me. Like it started with the Stargazer, and the Oracle is like the most recent. And, you know, I think to me, it's very clear how much more sophisticated the Oracle is than the Stargazer. The Stargazer was the beginning of me figuring out how to translate these things into experiences. And the Oracle is like me going through the journey of trying a bunch of different things and making a lot of different things and seeing how those things, the effect that those objects and experiences, you know, precipitate. And then the Oracle was really me intentionally creating a new mythology and a narrative that's loosely based on everything that I've learned, studied, experienced, all of those things.
Right. So there's, I guess, in both of those projects, there's some relationship to performance. The idea that in the stargazing chair, you're not just seated, but you're seated in relation to the stars. Or with the Oracle, that you're not just witnessing this illuminated object and hearing this music, but you're tuning it and you're positioning it yourself. So I'd love to know more. I know that you're also a musician, and so I'm curious about your relationship to performance and how performance can speak more, let's say, than an object by itself.
Yeah, I mean, with the Stargazer being the beginning of this, the thing that I learned when making the Stargazer was really about like an approach to design that is in tune with my ancestry, right? So I think the brief was it might have been an office chair brief. We were in school, and I remember thinking, well, I want to make something that is aligned with, you know, my heritage. And in looking at all of the furniture and like the stuff in the history books, the art history books and the museum stuff, and then having come from the culture and seeing how, my parents both coming from the village, how they actually operate, and then realizing that some of these things were kind of wrong with how the Western world had ascribed, meanings to the objects that they had stolen from us, right? So the Stargazer chair was me saying, well, where my people are from, you don't make a chair for just sitting, because you don't need a chair to sit. You can sit anywhere. So if you're gonna make a chair, you make a chair to do something, and that chair is a telephone to the ancestors, right? That's like, that chair is a telephone. And the stargazing, like in a lot of West African traditions, that's that's the communication method, right?
That's
Is
beautiful.
look, if you're looking to the ancestors in the sky, and not only that, like a lot of the museums accurately ascribe this chair to childbirthing, right? And the shape of the chair was ideal for both things for a reason. And I think it leads back to, like, again, within a lot of West African traditions, there's the idea of like the ancestors re-manifesting themselves in the children that are being born. So being in a position where you're simultaneously in commune with the ancestors and giving birth makes complete sense. And as a design object, that chair that you would see in a museum, and they would call it a birthing chair, like West African birthing chair, or whatever they put on the plaque. That object, was a lot deeper than what I think a lot of people understood, and that was one of the reasons that I called it the stargazing chair. There's also a reason why I lacquered it in bright orange, high gloss bright orange, rather than leaving it natural wood and similar to how you would see it traditionally. And it was a statement about, the direction that I saw kind of the world going, and also, the past that precipitated that direction. So the way that I got the angle of the chair was really by like we built a chair buck and just increased the angle until it was uncomfortable to read a book, uncomfortable to hold up an iPad or hold your phone up. So when you're sitting in the chair, you can't do anything except for look at the stars.
Well, I mean, clearly that chair has a direct relationship to what museums like to call the traditional birthing chair, as you were saying, right? The form, the angle of the seat, the kind of posture is definitely related. So, and you're in a sense building upon that. I wanted to just mention, interestingly enough, Lee Edelcourt was on the show earlier this week in dialogue with Glenn Adamson, and she spoke about animism and the idea that products can have a relationship to a kind of force that is out there connecting all of us. And I think she said something like Zoom is really dumb because we have to have this window that, is a very kind of, in a sense, difficult to negotiate. But the way that the trees communicate, for example, is much more sophisticated, or the way that the stars communicate. And her prediction is that if we can tap into that kind of new way of looking at objects and relating to objects, very much in line with your work and this kind of ancestral spirituality, we can achieve a kind of a higher level of consciousness, let's say.
Totally. I mean, I think that is the higher level of consciousness, right? I mean, this is just theory stuff. I mean, to some degree, but if you imagine that you're a neuron and I'm a neuron and we're doing our thing without communicating with each other in like the optimal neuron way, then the brain that we are a part of is like not operating at max capacity.
Right.
So the moment that we start really getting back to, in my opinion, the original way that we were meant to coexist as part of a unified body that has that is operating toward a goal, the closer we get to that, the closer we're going to get to a place where the rest of the things surrounding us as humans are no longer there to be dominated, right? We're still living out the attempt to dominate nature, dominate space, dominate anything that is not like you. Just dominate it. And it's literally the cause of, in my opinion, like the vast majority of our issues as a human race, is that, the beauty of something that is seemingly different from you is that it allows you to realize a part of yourself that is
Absolutely.
encompassed by that seemingly different thing that you have within you, that you are a part of by being in commune with that other.
The other,
And
yeah, the other teaches us about ourselves.
and not only that, the other is ourselves. Like the other, like it's silly because the concept of empty space is something that's so pervasive that delusion, you know, that that delusion, which is based on a localized experience, has been extrapolated into becoming a definition of the reality that we believe we're living in. But the fact of the matter is that, like, we've already seen that no matter how micro you get, there's still something there. There's no, like,
Yeah.
the empty space that you might say is inside an atom, that's spirituality. And that is not empty. That is just it's a volume, because it's defined by edges, first of all. But I mean, anyway, we're getting
No. This is great.
it's
This
getting
is great.
trippy.
It's great. But I mean, to be honest, when I look at some of your objects, and I'm not sure if other people have felt the same way, but there's something about it that is, to be quite honest, intangible, right? Even though it's a physical thing and it has a physical presence, there's
Yeah.
something that I don't understand. And it's in a sense, it's the not understanding that makes me connect more and sort of invites me in, right? So it is that dialogue with the other. And I mean, I wonder if it's about, people beginning to see themselves in some way in some of these things. And
completely. But like, I would challenge you to use a different word if you think it applies. But I'm not so sure that you don't understand it. You just might not be able to describe it or define it or put it into a box that you can hand to somebody that they would also see it the same way. And we tend to think that if we can't do that, that we don't understand something. But I feel like understanding is something that you feel. And I think that when I'm making objects, a lot of the time, it's intentional, and sometimes it's like I'm just making stuff and then it happens. But these objects are hopefully a finger pointing to the moon. So like what you're saying is that you don't understand, I think, is actually what I'm trying to create, is that intangible thing, but I need to make a tangible thing to point to it.
Well, it's kind of like, why is Ini trying to point to the moon right now? So listen, there's a couple of things that we want to cover. We're believe it or not, I can't believe we're running out of time, but I wanted to touch upon something that you said recently in one of our conversations off camera. You mentioned that you no longer sketch.
Not no longer, but a lot, not like I used to.
A lot less. So I'm curious how you're documenting your ideas, and then how that relates to your larger community, right? Like, at what point does Archie step in, and at what point does the gallery step in? And I'm also thinking about images I've seen of you in various workshops of production, like in Murano, etc. So give us a little bit of insight into your process.
Yeah, so I mean, I always had I grew up loving to draw, and it wasn't until drawing became homework that I started to hate drawing, to be honest. And the thing is that drawing, like when I do draw, it's abstract. It's not like an object. Because for me, the most, like, a drawing is never going to be as accurate as what's in my mind. And I store all of my designs in my head. So the design is there. The only reason that I would need to draw it is if I need to show a teacher that I'm doing my homework. And now that I don't have any more homework, I just keep the objects in my head until it's time to make them. And then I determine the best way to communicate what I'm trying to make. And, I think one of the best examples, we might see one of the lamps, but I did a project, the Formentera collection, where, you know, that it went to the extreme of that, right? Where we didn't have drawings. We didn't have, like, usually at some point I make a 3D model or a technical drawing and, you know, go to a craftsman and we figure out together how to get close to this thing that I've drawn based on the techniques that they use. But with this particular project, I had gotten comfortable enough with the glass blower that I work with, Mateo. And, you know, I came back from Formentera and I described an energy that I felt. And I described a vision that I had of, you know, the sunset, all the sunset sky getting balled up and into, like, you know, a liquid form, and then a droplet of it falling at my feet. And based on getting toward this feeling and this description and getting to the point where we both understood what the goal was, you know, he thought about it and then he was like, well, the best way to do it would be to just do it. So he ends up getting the pipe, climbing up on a ladder, and getting one of his stagiaires to get like a half of a mold from a previous project. And then, you know, he gets the molten glass, and then he starts to blow it, and he just like drops it into the form as if it was liquid falling from the sky. and we made 3 of these lamps, and all of them came out completely different, but they all had that feeling and that energy. And it was really just a matter of translating that energy. If I had given him a technical drawing, it would have been something that I either had to make with my hand or with some drawing tools or with a computer, which automatically would have sterilized it and made it not living.
I mean, that's the beauty of being able to work by hand, you know. And so in my experience, it's been exactly the same way, that you can't predict what the hand will make, because it's operating in a much more essential way than the drawing could ever work, right? So
exactly.
So the trick, I think, is when it comes to working with industrial production, how do we translate that sort of immediacy into something that's industrially produced? And so that brings us to the congratulations, man. No, we got to talk about this. You know, I just want to say congratulations on Hermes. I mean, this is a real breakthrough. As far as I'm aware, you may be the first of the diaspora to work with Europe's most esteemed luxury brand. And so that kind of opening doors, I think, is a really powerful statement. So I want to talk about how you brought all of, you know, your very innovative way of working, your spirituality, et cetera, to that project, and what that's about for you.
Yeah, I mean, first, I don't know if I am, simply because there are a lot of people that have designed scarves over the years. So I don't want to make the claim, but I definitely am the first one to design a watch. And I might be the first one to design an industrial product for them. But you know, the thing is about luxury, and part of what has drawn me to luxury is that it's familiar in the way that religions are familiar, right? It's familiar in the way that just plain spirituality is familiar. And the thing that makes designing something for a luxury brand or with luxury in mind basically easier than designing for you know, something that's just completely mass market and non-lux, is that it's already a given once you enter the luxury space that the object that you create, in order to be the most successful, needs to have as much intangible power as possible, right? If you are judging it based on its performance, solely based on its performance, it's hard to justify, you know, what people pay for these things, even the things that perform really well. Because you have to look at something like a Ferrari, right? It performs really well, but the people that are buying them for the most part never like actually use it to the fullest of its capacity. They're buying it for the intangible feeling that it gives them. And this is something that when I first started looking into luxury, Hermes stood out to me because I saw them as remaining true to that and practicing it at the highest level in comparison to the other brands that I was looking at. And that's what made me aspire to want to work with them, was the fact that like there's almost every object that you see in an Hermes shop has some kind of intangible thing about it. There's something about it that makes it feel special, that is beyond just the lines that were drawn to create it and the material that it's made of and the hand craftsmanship and all of that. And so when it came to the watch, it was really, really, really daunting as an idea that I was going to design an Hermes watch, simply because there's a man named Henri who has basically designed almost every single watch for Hermes. And he's probably in his 80s, I think now. I met him a couple of times. Yeah. And he started when he was super young. Yeah. And he was a friend of the family, and he's done everything from ties to everything. So for me to try to step in and answer this brief, which was really simply to create the next women's icon, it was like, well, I have to, whatever I do has to stand up next to what he has done. So I spent a lot of time really looking at the intangible things that made those designs powerful. And I cataloged a lot of it in order to understand what I was going to do. And then it was about searching for that feeling. So the process of designing this watch, much like the other things that I design, it's a waiting process. Like, I had to wait until this watch hit me. So, from the moment that I started.
How long did it take you?
It depends. It depends on where you
from initial brief to when you really had the design resolved. How long did it take?
Oh, from initial brief.
For that inspiration to strike, and then you arrive at Gallup.
Well, from the initial brief, it was. I guess I can say this now. I designed 3 watches before this one. So and this is the way that I work, is that yes, come in. Sorry, there's somebody at the door interrupting here. But the way that I work is that when I feel like I've found something and I've tapped into something, I see it in my head and then I create it. And each watch that I created, and I think this is why they were excited to work with me, was on point in different ways, but they weren't quite this yet. And it was really like Pierre-Alexis Dumas, the head creative director, that whenever they would it would get up to him, and I would feel super confident, and everybody, from the watch department would say, yeah, this is looking great. I think this is going to be great. And then Philippe, my watch mentor, would come back from the meeting and be like, Pierre-Alexis says there's something missing. And to Pierre-Alexis' credit, there's a certain type of genius, that someone like him has. And I see the flow state operating in him like on a constant level, but he knew exactly what to do. He looked at the watch that most of us thought would end up being the watch, and he said, has Ini been to the conservatoire yet? Has he been to the archives? And the answer was no. So then they sent me to the archives, and then on the train ride back from that trip, I did the one sketch of this watch that exists, and then just so that I wouldn't forget it, and then turned it around in my head for the rest of the trip. And by the time I got home, I just, it was there. And at that point, once something is there in my head and I can turn it around and look at it upside down and from all angles, it's just a matter of when am I going to have time to get in front of the computer and have 12 to 16 uninterrupted hours. And then we'll have something that the next day I can start to render and look at materials.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
So the waiting process is what takes time, but like
Yeah.
once it hits, it happens pretty quickly.
I can relate. I can relate.
And that can be frustrating for galleries and other clients as well.
It is a lot about, it's a lot about pre-visualization, right? Like, so that you feel confident, because the last thing you want to do is show something that you don't love, right? So
yeah. And like I'm really critical, and when I see something, when I go through the entire design process in my head, like a process tree, because like I said, I've been doing 3D modeling since I was 12. So like when I think of an object, I start from a blank screen in my mind, and I go step by step through all of the moves that I need to make in order for that object to come to fruition. So, you know, it might be 100 steps that I go through in my head, and then I'm like, okay, now I'm ready to go and do it really efficiently, you know? And after I've gone through all of that, if I'm looking at that object in my head and it's not perfect, I'm not gonna start doing anything because it doesn't make sense.
So Ini, I want to have time for questions, but I have one question. I have one last question for you. Speaking of steps in your head, what's next? I mean, where are we going next? And you can think about that and answer it at the very end. But now I think it's a great opportunity for us to open up and look at some questions.
Cool.
Let me see. There've been a lot. I'm hoping Lucy can help me navigate them here. Let's see. Let me see. I'm scrolling back. So there's some amazing comments. I'm not sure if you're looking at the chat, Ini, but
no, I don't see any of them.
yeah.
I don't even know how to access them.
Yeah, it's a little bit tricky, isn't it? Because Zoom is so dumb. So, you know, we've got everyone on now, including Glenn Adamson.
Hey, Glenn.
Yeah, so Glenn, of course, may have a lot of questions for you. But let's talk about, while we wait for, let me see, there might be one here. Let's talk about what is next on the horizon for you, Ini.
Next. I mean, funny enough, I feel like I've exited the stage of young designer. Like,
Did I call you young designer? I didn't mean to call you young designer. Did I say young designer?
No, you didn't. No, you didn't say that. But that, when I think about what's next, that's what's been on my mind, is that I've been like young, like the young guy, you know, in the room for so long. And I realized with the stuff that I'm working on now that I'm actually becoming a designer instead of a young designer now, because a lot of the focus for me now is about how to step into the phase of my career where I am truly helping others to reach their maximum potential as creatives, right? And also where I'm taking all the things that I've learned and trying to find a way to help others not have to learn by bumping their heads. So the biggest things for me right now are the Pavilion of the Diaspora and trying to get my concept of a studio, which I call LMNO Creative, off the ground in a real way. And those are the two most important things to me, because, you know, when I was in school, I noticed that I felt like an outlier, outcast, didn't always feel like my perspective was understood. And then I saw the others around that felt the same way, and we were usually friends. And then I would notice that, like, when I go to graduation, I could spot the students that I was like, wow, like they probably had a lot of trouble, you know, getting people to accept that it's okay for them to go the way that they were going. So, you know, that's when I started trying to figure out what kind of thing could I do to help that. And I also realized that I had particular advantages that a lot of my peers didn't, in the sense that the community around me was so diverse that I always had somebody that I could ask to figure out how to approach things. And they were usually not designers. So when I got my first contract, I wasn't asking other designers about the contract. You know, I was talking to my friends that were lawyers. I was talking to my friends that were accountants. And I was talking to now I talk to like my older brother who plans people, you know,
Yeah.
He's a financial
So,
wealth
so,
manager.
so LMNO stands for Leave My Name Off, correct?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. What is that
It's
concept about?
so LMNO it started as my thesis, and it was really my kind of tongue-in-cheek answer to designers as celebrities, and that concept. So there was. Do you remember a designer named Tobias?
Yeah, Tobias Wong, Toby
Yeah,
Wong.
yeah.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, we were friends.
So when I was in school, like he was like an inspiration to me as far as his approach to design, because it wasn't like
It,
design, and
it
it
was much
wasn't.
more artistic. He was, yeah.
Yeah,
People described him as a kind of Andy Warhol of design at the time.
yeah. And like
Brilliant.
I really dug that. And then, I looked up to guys like Mark Newson for like their business acumen. And then I looked up to, like the guys that were like Marcel Wanders, that like had their own kind of wild signature that made them these personalities, right? And like at the time also, like Karen Rashid was like, all over the place with like pink suits and like tattoos.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and I was like, man,
It's a lot, right? It's a lot.
it's a lot. It's a lot. And not only that, but like it was intriguing, it was exciting, and all of those things. And as I do, I get pretty self-reflective sometimes, and realizing that was potentially part of my path and my journey. I started to kind of just like look at, just take an objective view on what it really meant for that to be what drives the decisions that are made about what people should be existing with, like, and the types of spaces people should be existing in. Like, is this space good because somebody who's famous did it?
Yeah.
Is it going to feed my soul because that person is, well known?
Yeah.
And
this idea of the signature being, everything. So from
and
the literal handwritten signature to the signature all over a room, I think, it's
yeah.
always troubled me too.
And then, so I guess, and not to get too long, because I know we have to go, but so the whole point of LMNO was me realizing that if things went how I thought they were going to go, that I would reach a point where I would be very visible. And, at that point, I determined that I wanted to use my visibility to create a scenario where I am not the center of like the things that I am facilitating to be made, and that the things that are being made are made to like feed people's spirits more than they are to feed my own ego. So in order to do that, I determined that I needed to create something that was based on philosophy and an approach that could live beyond me and could live without my name, and be the director of it as long as I need to be, but have it be sort of an incubator in a way where talent can come in and have their moment of getting their voice out there, but then also return to LMNO to lead projects that are just for the good of everyone, without like in an egoless way. And we'll see how it goes. I don't know how it's going to go. Like, we're basically the pavilion and LMNO are me like stepping out of my comfort zone and doing the opposite of what I've always done, which is don't show anybody until it's finished. That's how I used to operate. And now everybody's going to watch if this fails.
I think what you're describing is a certain level of maturity where you recognize that the work is also about being of service, and that
100%.
At a certain point, being of service forces you to be more vulnerable, and I think it's that vulnerability that allows us to grow creatively. So we do have a few questions. I think Norman Teague, who was actually on the show about a week ago, is on. Norman, if you're there, would you like to ask your question directly?
Hi guys, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we got you.
Yep.
How you doing, Norman?
Great. Hey, how you doing, Stephen?
All right.
Great. Hey, Ini, how you doing, bro?
Good. How are you, sir?
Good. Hey, I just wanted to. Because I've been really pushing materials that are influential to a lot of the storytelling. And I'm just wondering if there's something out there that you haven't worked with that you might be interested in that might help further your storytelling.
Like physical materials, you mean?
Yes, yes.
Well, there are a great many that I haven't worked with. But I have kind of a strange relationship with materials. I don't necessarily research them and think about them that often. I'm usually pleasantly surprised whenever I see a material or a new material or an old material that used in a new way that makes me feel something that I've been trying to capture. That
Sure.
makes sense. So like the stories are there, and the stories, are kind of latent in the back of my mind, but there are the poignant moments of those stories that I'm always on the lookout to see how to illustrate. And new materials usually mean being able to tell a story that I haven't tried to tell before.
So it's a narrative coming first, in a sense.
Sometimes, I mean, to be honest, like it's not planned. It's however it's different every time.
Sure.
Like there are narratives sitting there, and then sometimes you see something and it creates a narrative. I mean, it's one of the reasons I love glass and crystal, because every time there's so many different permutations of how you can manipulate that material. And every time I walk into a workshop in Murano or with the glassblower I work with here in Switzerland, and I see something them doing something I haven't seen before, I'm like, what is that technique? And how do I apply it to something?
I wanted to mention, thank you, Norman. Great question. I wanted to mention, Ini, to everyone, that your Instagram is incredibly inspiring, and shout out to Archie for. I've never seen an Instagram. I've never seen anything like it. It's musical. It's performative. It's documentary. I mean, it's really entertaining.
Well, I'm gonna take credit for it now. Archie kickstarted it when he was living with me and we were working on stuff. He kickstarted it, and then he showed me the way. But I appreciate that. I always feel like it could be a lot better. But
just to speak to people who want to go deeper into your process and your way of working, there's a lot of information on the gram, and there's some really insightful moments of you working with material for the first time. I especially like the new bowls I saw being developed with a kind of mosaic technique in glass. We have another question from Sandra Sherman, and then I think we have to wrap it up, guys. Sandra, are you with us? Would you like to ask your question directly, or?
Sure, I'll ask it. I asked, how has living in Europe influenced your design thinking, and what precipitated your decision to relocate there?
So as far as the thinking goes, I learned about like traditional craft in Switzerland, and I talk about Switzerland because I live in Switzerland. Yes, Europe, and I work with European manufacturers and craftsmen, but really I've learned the European stuff that I've learned has been in Switzerland, and I see it as different from the rest of Europe, to be quite honest. And some of the biggest things that I've learned in Switzerland that also keeps me in Switzerland, that I really appreciated going to school in Switzerland for, is like the Swiss approach to design that has made it so that almost every typeface that you use was probably made by a Swiss designer. The meticulous perfection of things is something that sings to my soul. And the fact that craftsmen working with their hands maintain that level of perfect execution that you would imagine coming from a machine, yet still has like the living soul of perfect imperfection in everything they make. That's what kept me in Switzerland really was the fact that I couldn't imagine living somewhere else where I wouldn't be able to like ask somebody and find out about a guy in the mountains with a shack and a bunch of tools that does amazing woodwork, right? And things like that. And then what brought me to Europe was wanting to study at the luxury program at ICAO. And before that, I was living in Singapore actually, and it was really I mean, honestly, in a lot of ways, it was the fact that living in Singapore gave me a new perspective on how I could experience my life. Like living in the US was great and exciting and fun, but a lot of times exciting in ways that I didn't want that excitement. And Singapore was a place that was orderly and honestly the first time that I ever felt safe in my life. And I didn't want to give that up. And so when thinking about leaving Singapore, I wanted to be in a place that was similar, but I guess similar in those ways, but then more comfortable in other ways. And Switzerland fit that bill. And I know a lot of people think that it's boring or too quiet, but that's kind of what I love about it. Did that answer the question?
I think that's a pretty good answer. Thank you, Sandra. I'm just adding to the chat a book called 100 Years of Swiss Design from the Museum of Modern Art in Mexico City. The book and the exhibition were curated by a friend of mine, designer and curator, Francisco Torres, who also studied at the ICAO. So I think the studio is called Torres Hanhausen. I'm just sharing that with everyone. It's a great document of design in Switzerland.
And I really encourage people to look at Swiss design. I don't know if we got to the picture of me and Pierre Keller, rest in peace, Pierre Keller.
Yeah. Pierre was great.
And, you know, it was really when I was at ICAO and I would look through the books like that he published of exhibitions that he did with other designers, that I started to see how much humor and like the Swiss design is like, to understand Swiss design is like understanding like a Jay-Z verse, where it's, you know, like on the surface, it'll just be, it comes out super clean and you're like, oh, I totally got what he was saying. But then you listen to it again, you're like, oh, he was saying something else right there. And then you're like, oh, wait, every single bar was a double entendre. So there was double meanings on everything. That's how I see a lot of Swiss design. I mean, you have to think, like you look at a typeface, like take your most popular typeface, Helvetica. Like if you were to talk to the designer of Helvetica and say, what's behind that? There's probably so much stuff, but on the surface, it's just the cleanest, most simplest, most direct and pure thing, right? And I love Swiss design. I love the museums. I spend a lot of time with my daughter at all those museums.
It's so interesting because to look at your work, we don't immediately feel, right? I mean, I have to say, I don't immediately feel the Swiss influence, but to know that there's this kind of underlying relationship to the component parts that tries to arrive at a kind of direct legibility, I think is, you know, it's another reading of the work that I think we'll all have to continue with. Ini, this has been amazing. Hey, thank you so much. Really,
good.
Yeah, I think we're good. I really appreciate this conversation being my first with Design and Dialogue. I'd like to also mention, before we wrap up, next Monday, Glenn Adamson will be in dialogue with Joseph Walsh. So please, let's all tune in for that. All right. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Stephen. This was amazing.